so far in our class, we talked a lot about big picture stuff about psychology. We talked about what psychology is, we did a little bit of a history of psychology, so everything's been kind of like fluffy and conceptual so far, right? And now we're going to be moving into something that's a little more nitty-gritty. So this is our first actual topic of what people study topic-wise in psychology, and that's going to give us some more information about something more nitty-gritty than just history or conceptual stuff. So today, what you're going to see is maybe a little bit more information on the slide, a little more diagrams, and if you can't scribble everything down, or if you're feeling like this is overwhelming, that's totally fine. These slides will go up on Brightspace, and you'll be able to just look at them from there. They're supposed to be a resource, so that's why there's more information on here than usual. Does that make sense? All right. So people who take notes on the slides, are you able to see the slides on Brightspace? No. Okay. This has been happening recently, so I wanted to check if there's a glitch. I just will upload the new version here, and then we'll get started. In the meantime, while I'm doing this, does anyone have any questions or things that aren't working with Launchpad or anything like that? No? Everything's working well? Awesome. That's a big upgrade from last semester. We had some issues there. I'm glad it's working. Okay, so, all right, I just refreshed from my side of things, but let me know if something didn't work. Anything yet? Okay. Oh, sorry, we're moving on to neuropsych now. So it'll be neuropsychology and the materials for class. Yeah. Sweet. Okay. Good to hear. All right. So what we're going to be doing today, I already checked in here. Other side note is just to bear with me. If I can't remember your name, I'll ask you to tell me for this week, and next week my goal is to be done with that kind of stuff. So I'll try to stick with it, but bear with me as that happens. And today we have two big goals. So the first big goal is to describe how neurons communicate with each other. So I talked how we're going to be going a little bit nitty-gritty today. Neurons is about as specific as it gets when it comes to psychology and anatomy. So we'll talk about how neurons communicate, and we'll talk about two major systems in the body. So the nervous system and the endocrine system. And we'll talk about how those two systems are underlying all of our behaviors in psychology. All right. So in terms of plan for class today, we're going to start with the nervous system. We're going to do some talking. I'll show you some videos. Then we'll do like a super embarrassing activity. Get ready for that. And then we'll talk about the endocrine system afterwards. All right? Okay. So first of all, why do we even care about this? This is a psychology class. I did not think I was signing up for neurons. If that's you, the reason that we care is because all of these things that we're doing psychologically, so everything we're thinking and feeling, the behaviors that we're showing, all of those pieces of who we are have biological underpinnings. So it's not to say that like you're genetically made this way, that's exactly how you're going to be. What I'm saying here is that every time we're doing something or feeling something, something else is going on in our brain at the neural level. So we have the psychology part, but we also have the physiological part. So what is our body doing? And that's what we're talking about today. So a lot of things that are happening in our biology, in our body, are underpinning our behaviors. And that totally goes along with that biopsychosocial model that I showed you, I guess, on our first What is Psychology lecture. So when we first talked about that model, you'll remember there were three big parts. The biology part, the psychological part, and the social part. It talks about how those three pieces all come together when we're trying to talk about someone's behavior. So look something like this. We have a biological piece. That's kind of what we're going over today. We have what our brain's doing, what the hormones in our body are doing. All those different pieces are biological pieces. Maybe your genetic predispositions. Psychological piece is our cognitions, how we think, how we feel. And the social piece is sort of like a situational part. What neighborhood are you from? What kind of characteristics do you bring with you because of your friends or your family? And that social piece is just as important as the other ones, but all three come together to determine our behavior. So in psychology, we're looking at all these three things combined when we're describing sort of life and how humans work. All right, so diving in here. Neurons are the itty-bitty pieces here in our brains. So the elementary components just means like the smallest possible thing we can look at here inside of our brains, and they're the cells that make things work. So a neuron is one of the cells in our brains, and it communicates with other cells through an electrochemical system. So we have a chemical part. Everyone's heard of like brain chemistry before. That's something people say. The chemical piece is that there are chemicals moving in our brain that cause an electrical signal to happen. We'll go over that in way more detail in a minute. And those two pieces together, so one cell being a neuron, and then that neuron communicating with other neurons, is how information is processed in the brain. So when you have a thought, or when you want to move your arm, or whatever else is going on, all those things have underpinnings of neurons communicating. So if you want to move your arm, your brain has to fire and move connections in your brain, move a message along in order to make that happen. Does that make sense on like the highest conceptual level? Okay. All right, so quick poll. How many people have had like neuroanatomy types of courses before that have some background in neurons? Okay, actually more than I thought. Okay, so if you don't have familiarity, that's the way that I made this class. So my assumption is that we know nothing, and we'll build up from there. Okay, in the spirit of knowing nothing and building from there, here is just a picture, a little illustration of a neuron's anatomy. So all the way over here, we have the cell body. When you think of a cell in your head, and you're thinking back to like 7th grade biology, you probably think of that like, sound like a good marker? Like globby cell with like a little nucleus in the middle. This is the thing that most closely represents that. The cell body is kind of like, you can picture all those parts and pieces. The thing that makes a neuron unique is this axon piece. So we have this long stem in the middle, and that's where the electrical signal is going to happen. So when we fire, when we say our neurons are firing or our brain's firing, that's what we mean. This electrochemical signal that's passing down this axon. And at the end, we have the axon terminal, where that's sending the next message. Okay? So, think of these as like little gecko hands. We have the cell body that's receiving signals, and then the axon terminal that's passing on to the next cell. Okay? So, you can imagine in this illustration, there'd be another cell here. Okay? All right, so pieces to remember. We have our cell body, also called the soma. The dendrites are the receiving end of the branches. The axon, where the message actually gets sent through, the electrochemical part. The myelin sheath, which is like cool noodle covering onto the axon. And then at the end, we have the axon terminal, which are the little gecko hands that are passing on the message. All right, so I feel like we have the parts and pieces down here. All right, so neurons work based on that electrochemical signal. That's how they're going to pass a message to the next neuron. And in order for a neuron to even send that signal in the first place, it has to receive a signal that meets a minimum threshold. All right, so forget about neurons for a second, and imagine like in your day-to-day, there's all these things that are happening to you. You're like walking around, you see people, you're like brushing your teeth, you're getting dressed, you go, you eat, you go to class. All these things are happening. And at the end of the day, you meet up with your friends or whatever, and you have to decide what things are worthwhile telling your friends. So your friends probably don't want to hear about how long you brushed your teeth, or how many steps you took from the bathroom to your dorm room, or even like what shirt everyone was wearing in your class. All those things are like boring stories. No one wants to hear that. But if something really exciting happens, if you saw something really cool, or if some like cool person came on campus, whatever it may be, all of a sudden that story meets a minimum threshold to be like, oh yeah, I should probably share this. I'm going to tell these people this. This is actually interesting enough to pass on. And a neuron is doing the same thing. It's getting signals, but those signals don't necessarily get passed on unless they meet that minimum threshold. Unless you have a cool enough story, we're not going to tell the next person. Does that make sense? Minimum threshold down? All right. Second thing, the electrical impulse. So what's happening in that pool noodle area, in the axon and the myelin sheath, is that once we decide a story is cool enough to tell, there's a lot of things that have to happen. So we have ions, potassium and sodium ions, moving in and out of that pool noodle area, and that's going to create our electrical signal. So whoever created like static signals when you're a little kid with your socks on the carpet, does anyone ever do that? You like make static electricity, you go like this, and then the next thing you touch has that electric static, right? Same thing's happening here. We're having chemicals moving in and out. They're creating that charge, and the signal passes down. So there's that spark at the end. Make sense? All right. Last piece. So the whole process together isn't really electricity except for those chemicals. That's what's creating the electrical charge. So I kind of already explained that a little bit. But the idea is that all these parts and pieces together create the signal that gets passed from one neuron to the next, and then that neuron to the next one, and so on. All right, important note, this is an all or none process. So as soon as something passes that minimum threshold, it's going to fire. There's nothing like a half signal that gets sent. It's either, if this is our minimum threshold, anything above here is going to send a signal, anything below here is not, and there's no in between. Okay, how do we feel about neuron basics so far? Good? Okay. All right, so when I'm talking about electrochemical signals, the real name for this is called an action potential. And this is the electrical charge that passes down that axon area where the pool noodle thing is over it. That whole area, when it's electrically charged and passes things down, that's an action potential. And what's going on, if you really zoom in here, is that we have some ions, so some electrically charged element pieces here, going in and out. So we have some positively charged, some negatively charged, and they're creating electricity through that movement. So we have this pool noodle thing, that's myelin sheath, over the axon. And by moving in and out of that membrane, that's how we're getting the electric charge. Okay, any questions about how this happens? Ready to move on? Okay, putting it all together. So if you imagine this is time, so we're moving over time here, the first thing that's going to happen in creating an action potential is that signal reception. So we're receiving signal, we're receiving stimulus, here's what's happening, and these ones are all the like really boring stories. So this is brushing your teeth, walking to your room, all those things that you've never told anyone else. Then, this is our cool story that we're actually going to tell our friends. And we know it's our cool story because it passed the minimum threshold. So once it passes that point, then we know that's something that we want to pass on. That ignites the electrochemical signal. So our ions are moving in and out. We have sodium and potassium ions moving here. And then this part is that signal part. And then we have to put all of those ions back to where they came from. So we have a sodium pump and a potassium pump that gets everything back to where it started. And then at that point, we're back in our resting state, and that's when the signal can get a new signal and pass on something else. So another action potential can't happen until all those ions are back where they should be. All right, how do we feel about this? Good? All right, well, that's good to hear, because here's the embarrassing activity that I was talking about at the beginning of class. What we're going to do is create a human action potential. And in COVID, this looks like sitting in your chair and doing weird things with your arms, so bear with me. All right, over here, you guys are the cell body, or the soma. This row, you're the start of the axon. This row, you're sodium ions. This row is going to be potassium ions. You're the pump, and you guys are the axon terminal. So the cell body, your job is to decide whether the story is cool enough to pass on. I won't make you actually do that in this example. So you're going to basically count together and clap. And that's going to be your decision that the story is cool enough or you've reached that minimum threshold. Once the clap happens, Axon, you've got to start the process of creating an electrical signal. So you're going to do this with your arms. You're going to come from this side to that side. All right, the first group of ions, and our second group, both of you guys. As soon as you get that signal, you have to create an electrical charge. So you're going to be doing that by doing this neurons. All right, that's going to be you moving in and out of the myelin sheath. That's going to be the process of creating electricity. All right, then, skipping over here, the axon terminal, once that electrical charge passes through, you pass on to the next cell by slapping this wall. But don't do it too hard to annoy the people next door. But now, we have all of our ions in the wrong place. So we have ions that should be in our cell that are outside, and the ones that should be outside that are inside. So your job as the pump is to get everybody back to where they should go. And that's how you do that. All right? So you're going to be doing this with your arms. Okay, to review. We got the soma making the decision whether it passes the minimum threshold. We got the axon getting things going. We got our ions going through in and out of the myelin sheath. We have the axon terminal passing on the message. And then we have the pump getting everything back together. All right? Okay. Do our first action potential here. You can start whenever you have received a good signal. You can like count to 3 or whatever.
An exciting story.
Yeah, that one.
What's an exciting story?
3, 2, 1.
Yep, that's the signal. Pass it on. All right, pump, get everybody back together. All right, okay, let's try another time. Here, let's go a little through this. All right. Ready, go.
2, 1.
There we go. Ions are moving. Message gets passed on. Pump bring us back together. All right. So what we know now is that we have some decision-making group, right? You guys didn't do anything until the soma did something. So they had to decide whether the message was getting passed on. It met that minimum threshold, and then our electrical charge happened. So we had ions moving in and out of that myelin sheath. Then the message reached the axon terminal. So we passed the electricity from the soma down to the ends. And the terminal is where the next message was passed on, and then our pump brought everyone back together. So imagine this, when you're thinking of an action potential, what's really happening here is that there's this series of processes that creates an electric charge and then allows a message from one cell to the next cell. All right? Okay. So now we know what happens inside of one cell. But the question is, what happens on the other side of that axon terminal? So you have our little gecko fingers at the end of the cell. Where do they actually go? How does that work? And the answer is, all that communication happens in something called the synapse. So this is just a little gap between the gecko fingers of one cell and the receiving gecko fingers of the next cell. So remember those dendrites and the axon terminal? They're touching each other just like this close together, where there's just a little gap. And this gap is called the synaptic gap or the synaptic cleft, and that's where chemicals are passing through. So remember we had that cool story? The cool story is one of these chemicals. That's what we're actually sending on. So you can see in here we have all these tiny little chemicals released, and then on the other side there are certain receptors that can actually receive those messages. So at the very end, after that electrical signal happens, what's really happening is a chemical release or no chemical release and a chemical update. That make sense? All right. In the spirit of not hearing me talk the entire class, here's a quick video that explains exactly what's happening in that synaptic cleft. If you're someone who, like, neuroscience is intimidating and you want to hear more about it, this YouTube channel, you can find it in the slides, is one that's really helpful. It's like 2-minute neuroscience or something like that, and they have a lot of good resources. Okay, I'll play this.
Welcome to 2-Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss synaptic transmission. Most communication between neurons occurs in a specialized structure called a synapse. Synapse is an area where 2 neurons come close enough to one another that they are able to pass chemical signals from one cell to another. The neurons are not actually connected, but are separated by a microscopically small space called the synaptic cleft. The cleft is less than 40 nanometers wide. By comparison, a human hair is about 75,000 nanometers wide. The neuron where the signal is initiated is called the presynaptic neuron, while the neuron that receives the signal is called the postsynaptic neuron. In the presynaptic neuron, there are chemical signals called neurotransmitters that are packaged into small sacs called vesicles. each vesicle can contain thousands of neurotransmitter molecules. When the presynaptic neuron is excited by an electrical signal called action potential, this causes the vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane and release their contents into the synaptic cleft. Once they are in the synaptic cleft, neurotransmitters interact with receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. They bind to these receptors and can cause an action to occur in the postsynaptic cell as a result. This action may involve increasing the likelihood that the postsynaptic cell will become activated and fire an action potential, or decreasing it. Eventually, the neurotransmitter molecules must be cleared from the synaptic cleft. Some of them will simply drift away in a process called diffusion. In some cases, the neurotransmitter is taken back up into the presynaptic neuron in a process called reuptake. Once back inside the presynaptic neuron, the neurotransmitter can be recycled and reused. In other cases, enzymes break down the neurotransmitter within the synaptic cleft. Then the component parts of the neurotransmitter can be sent back into the presynaptic neuron to make more neurotransmitter.
All right, so way more detail than you need to know for this class. But the point of that video is just to show you that there are chemicals moving from each side, and they're moving towards, let's see here, I can draw this, they're moving towards something that can receive it. So we have some neurotransmitter. In real life, they aren't like squares, but we have one neuron, this is the one that's passing on the signal. The next neuron has receivers that can actually perfectly receive whatever message. And sometimes there are neurons around that don't receive that kind of signal, so those ones will do nothing afterwards. These neurotransmitters are intended for the kinds of cells that can actually do something with that message. Okay? All right, what's our confidence level right now? Good, medium, bad? All right, that's good news. Okay. So, moving on here. Now let's zoom in. We just learned about the synaptic cleft. Let's talk a little bit about neurotransmitters. So, like I said, this is similar to a lock and key situation. If we have a square neurotransmitter, again, not a real life thing, we have to have a square receptor in order to get that signal. If instead we had a receptor that looked like this, that square is not going to fit in there, and then we're not going to move to fire this next cell. That won't reach the minimum threshold in the next cell. So receptors are really responsible for collecting information for the neurons. Once it actually accepts a neurotransmitter, so if this square goes into the square receptor, then we have a chain of events. And this could be something in your body that's physically changing. It could be an emotion or feeling. You could be blocking pain from something bad happening. So your body's going to experience changes, and it's going to be obviously a change in the actual cell. So to take a look at how this happens and how cells are communicating with each other in the brain, I'll show you an actual example of a mouse brain. And when things are lighting up, that means that we're getting evidence of that electrochemical signal. All right, so what's happening, what you can see here is that when we have a neuron express an action potential, you'll see that this is happening in like clusters, really quickly. And the things around it are the ones that are next ones to fire. So it's kind of cool to watch where you're seeing lots of cells communicating together. And then there's like just like a repeated pattern of this, because we're constantly having thoughts, we're constantly having sensations, whatever else it may be, that are causing our neurons to fire. Okay, neurotransmitters, the actual little messengers, can do two types of things. One group of neurotransmitters are excitatory neurotransmitters, and these make the neurons more likely to fire. So remember I was telling you that you have to have an exciting story, but remember all the boring stories, like brushing your teeth and seeing someone's whatever logo on their shirt? An excitatory neurotransmitter is the friend at the end of the day that's like, oh my gosh, that's such a cool story, I want to hear it again, even when you're telling the really boring story. This person is like your personal hype person that's going to always have you tell the story. They're so excited for you. And so this neurotransmitter is going to tell the next neuron to fire more likely than it would have. So this is making the next neuron more likely to have an action potential happen. All right, on the flip side, we also have the kind of friend that even thinks your most exciting story is super boring and embarrassing. So like, do not tell it to anyone else. Like, never say that again. This person would be an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So their job is to make the next neuron less likely to fire. So what they're doing is shutting down a message. And the excitatory neuron is making the message more likely. So going back here, once this neuron has an action potential happen, they're sending out neurotransmitters. This little square neurotransmitter could be one of those two things. And then that's going to determine what happens in the next step. Clear? Cool. This is just, I wanted to give you some real life examples. So we've talked a lot about like illustrations and cartoons, and it makes it hard to understand what's actually happening in the body. So examples of specific neurotransmitters in our actual body in real life would be things like endorphins that are affecting the way we interpret pain. There are certain neurotransmitters that affect muscle action or learning or memory. Any kind of like drug, like alcohol or weed or anything like that, that's affecting brain chemistry through neurotransmitters. So all these different things are affecting us on this level. So what neurotransmitters are the kinds of things that are underpinning our behavior. So that's why we care about this in psychology, is because even this little tiny thing is actually affecting the things that we do and the way that we act. Okay, so we talked about the two different types of neurotransmitters. So we had excitatory and inhibitory. And now we have another thing to learn here. So we have antagonists and agonists. So antagonists are molecules that inhibit a neurotransmitter's action. And agonists are ones that make the neurotransmitter's actions increase. So, all right, excitatory and inhibitory is talking about this piece of information, the actual neurotransmitter. The antagonists and agonists would be other things that come in and either block this or tell it to keep going. So a neurotransmitter itself can be excitatory or inhibitory, and it can be affected by outside influences, which would be considered antagonist or agonist. So this may be like certain hormones in your body that are changing your chemistry here, but it's some outside influence that's affecting the way your neurotransmitter is functioning. So how do we feel about the distinction between the excitatory and inhibitory things versus antagonist and agonist? Got a few nods? Awesome. Okay, so to give this another example here, we're going to watch how neurotransmitters can directly affect the next cell, and also how these outside influences can impact neurotransmitter functions. Quick example here.
This is Susan. Susan loves to bike. While out for a ride, she falls and breaks her arm. Special cells called neurons send a signal from the spinal cord to the brain, which interprets the signal as pain. Susan understands that pain means she needs to go to the hospital, but her body is equipped for survival, helping her not to panic so she can seek help. Many of her neurons are covered in proteins called opioid receptors. These receptors act like a brake to slow down the neuron's ability to send pain signals. When injured, the body releases natural painkillers called endorphins. Like a key in a lock, endorphins activate opioid receptors, slowing down the pain signal and preventing the panic. Susan gets treated for the broken bone, but 3 months later, her arm still hurts. And now that pain is making her feel depressed and anxious. So her doctor prescribes an opioid painkiller. There are many different opioids, but they all share a chemical similarity to our own endorphins. This allows them to bind to the same opioid receptors and stop pain signals. But that's not all they do. Deep inside Susan's brain is a region called ventral tegmental area, or VTA for short. The VTA is full of neurons that produce a chemical called dopamine. When something good happens, dopamine is released, giving Susan a feeling of pleasure. This helps teach your brain to keep seeking out good things. To keep dopamine levels in check, inhibitory neurons keep the brakes on it to
neurons look like and what they're doing with each other, but not every neuron is sending the same kind of signal, or not every neuron has the same job. This is also showing that we have neurotransmitters that act like locking keys. In this little example, they were really swimming little keys that can only go to cells that have the right kind of receptors. So those are messages that are specific to certain cells. Other thing that's illustrated was the whole idea of agonists and antagonists. So the body's endorphins, so like when she first broke her arm, what were the body's endorphins doing to that pain signal in the neurons? They're slowing it down. When you break your arm, you don't want to keep feeling pain. So your body is naturally coming in and sending in antagonists that are going to slow down a message of pain. And that's going to help you out because you don't want to feel pain when you break your arm. All right, then we had opioid painkillers come in, and those were giving other signals to our body. So what kind of signal does the opioid painkiller give?
It's like an agonist.
Yeah, it was an agonist. So what it was doing is releasing more dopamine that was helping with the pain test. That was having the end result that was similar because it was helping with the pain too, but it was doing it in a different way. So again, there's lots of different functions of neurotransmitters, lots of different types of neurons, and all these things are happening in tandem in the nervous system to make your body sort of react to the environment. Okay, so now we've got to zoom out a little. We talked a lot about the nitty-gritty. We know exactly what a neuron is. We know what types of communication it has with other neurons. And now we have to figure out, okay, what do all those neurons put together do in our body? So the nervous system is all of our body's nerve cells, and they actually connect with each other, from head to toe. So there's two parts here. All right. So the first part is the central nervous system, and this is just your brain and your spinal cord. This is like, home base, the main center of information for your nervous system. And then the peripheral nervous system are the nervous system parts that are all over the rest of your body. So it's not the brain and the spinal cord, but the ones that extend to your limbs. They capture things like sensory, so feeling things, or motor neurons that are moving your body. And they connect through the central nervous system to everything else in your body to collect information and to do something about it. So your neurons are not only sending messages about, what things to release in your head to make it feel less painful, but also telling your body which moves to make with your muscles, how your skeleton should move. So there's a lot of things going on here. In the nervous system, like I just talked about, there's a little breakdown. And for all the visual people, you can see the green part highlighted is just your brain and your spinal cord. So the central nervous system is like the information desk capturing all of what's going on. The peripheral nervous system extends everywhere else, and there are even more breakdowns here. So in terms of like studying later on, this hierarchy can get a little confusing. So right now, just like let it wash over you, think about it, and later on you can get into the nitty-gritty. The first big breakdown in the peripheral nervous system is whether it's autonomic nervous system or the somatic nervous system function. In the autonomic nervous system, this is the kind of functions that are happening without you knowing about them. So your lungs moving, your heart's beating, you're digesting stuff. Hopefully you're not thinking about that all the time. It's just happening without you knowing. And there's two types of functions within that sort of unconscious area, the autonomic system. One of them is functions that sort of promote, things getting going. You think of like fight or flight or needing to get somewhere. All of those kinds of reactions are in that sympathetic side. The parasympathetic side is going to be the calming reactions. So slowing down your heartbeat, slowing down your breathing, your pupils contracting, all that stuff where you're calming down after something big happens, that's in the parasympathetic side. So, of all the automatic things that are happening, we have things that get us going, things that calm us down. On the flip side, we have the somatic side of the peripheral nervous system. So, the somatic side is all the things that we're consciously aware of. So anytime we're like feeling textures, we're getting sensations, that's that sensory input part. but it's also responsible for how our body moves, so motor input. So neurons are also giving us information about where we want to move our arm, or how we pick up our water bottle, or whatever it may be. Okay, so to go over this in table form, somatic nervous system, we're aware of this. This is voluntary, we're choosing to do it. It has to do with our skeletal system and how we move. The autonomic nervous system is involuntary. We don't know that our body is digesting something necessarily. It affects more like our internal organ muscles and glands. Okay, so remember that first division in that autonomic side is sympathetic versus parasympathetic. This is a really helpful table if you need to come up with some examples of the types of things these two things do. Remember that the sympathetic is the arousing part, the parasympathetic is the calming part. So these are all bodily functions that fall into those two categories. So things like digestion, slowing your heartbeat, those are parasympathetic things. And things like your pupils dilating and your heartbeat increasing, those are things that are on the sympathetic side. Make sense? We have the calm and the excited part. The somatic nervous system, remember I talked about sensory neurons and motor neurons. So sensory input is what are you feeling? This could be like textures, any sort of like input from the environment. And the motor neurons is kind of like the what are you going to do about it? How are you going to move and make things happen? Within that system, there are some different names for those neurons, and they're really complicated. Sensory neurons and motor neurons. So here is exactly what they're doing. So sensory neurons carry messages from your senses to your central nervous system. So remember we talked about the central nervous system being your brain and your spinal cord, it's like a home base. Sensory neurons are the ones that are taking that signal of feeling something or whatever it may be back to the central nervous system. Motor neurons are the ones that are actually carrying instructions from your central nervous system to your body to move and do something. And then interneurons are the ones that are processing information between the sensory information and the the motor output. So I'm feeling this, I got to do something about it. If I fall and break my arm, I have to get up and move. If I get stung by a bee, I need to go off and get a Band-Aid, move away from the bee. And importantly, these interneurons are all within that brain and spinal cord, in the central nervous system. So that's sort of where things have to go to get translated. Okay, example here. Very exciting. There's a candle on the table and someone's putting their finger over it. So what are the kinds of neurons that are telling that person, wow, your finger's really hot, you're going to burn yourself? You just shout it out. Sensory neurons. And what type of neurons are telling the brain to move your finger away?
Motor.
Motor neurons, yeah. And then what kind of neuron communicates between sensory neurons and motor neurons? Interneurons. So this is like our translator. Inside the central nervous system, in the brain and spinal cord, it's translating the signal. Okay, so that wraps up the nervous system part. Do we have any questions about what's going on, whether it's at the neural level or just like in the whole body in general? All right, so the flip side of what we were talking about today is the endocrine system. So we just talked about the nervous system for a long time. We're moving on. The endocrine system, instead of being like electrochemical and speedy and in between the individual cells, the endocrine system is a process of secreting hormones into the bloodstream. We're still passing messages throughout the body, but it's in a different way. So we have hormones that actually travel through the body. They're the messengers in this case. You have the pituitary gland, that's like the gland in charge of all the other glands in your body, and that tells them to secrete certain hormones. So if you imagine certain glands in your body are responsible for certain types of hormones, the pituitary gland tells which one to go. And that way there are different tasks being done. And the hypothalamus is like the pituitary gland's boss. So this is like the CEO of the endocrine system. And that's the one that's telling the pituitary gland whether or not to release something for the other glands to then release the specific hormones. Does that hierarchy make sense there? You have the hypothalamus telling the pituitary gland what to do, and the pituitary gland is telling other glands to release hormones. again, for my picture people out there, what you can see here is that all over the body there are different glands that are responsible for different kinds of hormones. So whether it's sex hormones, or regulating calcium, or metabolism, or whatever it may be, there are these glands that are releasing messengers, hormones, through your bloodstream to make different things happen in your body. And again, going back to why we care about this in psychology, all those different messages are going to affect our behavior. So having different levels of these kinds of things in your bloodstream is affecting the way that your brain is processing information, and then the way that you behave. All right, so any questions about the endocrine system here? Makes intuitive sense, you're familiar with hormones and that kind of stuff? Okay, so turn around, look at somebody near you, and talk about two different things for about 5 minutes here. We need to think, what are the ways that the endocrine system and nervous system are similar, and which ones are different? Alright, sounds like most people are now like just chatting. Do we have some answers to these questions? No, maybe? Okay. What are some of the things that you talked about with your group? What are the ways that you came up with that these two systems are similar, and which ways are they different? Yeah, so they both have some messengers. The whole point of these systems is to pass some message, send some signal in the body. So you have hormones and neurons sending different action potentials that would release neurotransmitters. So you have two messenger systems. What other things do you talk about with your groups? Okay, we all got a really good main point of this class that they have messengers. That's good. Which system is faster? The nervous system. Yeah. So if we're using electricity and chemicals, that's really fast. If we're waiting for our hormones to travel through our bloodstream, that's much slower. All right. Which one involves the brain? Okay, that was a little bit of a trick question. The nervous system and the endocrine system both involve the brain because the hypothalamus is inside the brain and all the neurons are obviously in the brain too. All right. I think that's good. You've had a good handle, even though we're being a little shy right now. But enjoy the rest of your week. I will see you on Friday. Thanks for your good class. Thank you. Yeah.